Picture the Sahara Desert. Go ahead, close your eyes for a second and just picture it. You're probably seeing an endless ocean of golden sand dunes, maybe a lone camel trudging across a ridge, heat waves shimmering above cracked, lifeless earth. It's one of the most iconic landscapes on the planet, and it feels ancient. It feels permanent, like it has always been exactly this: dry, brutal, and empty. But what if I told you that image is completely wrong? What if beneath those billions of tons of sand, buried under centuries of dust and silence, there is an entirely different world? One that most people have never heard of. A world with rushing rivers, green riverbanks, animals drinking from wide, slow-moving water, and here's the part that's gonna blow your mind: people. Humans. Living, moving, building fires, making tools, and calling this place home. This isn't mythology. This isn't ancient folklore passed down through desert tribes. This is science. And over the last several decades, researchers have been piecing together one of the most extraordinary puzzles in geological and archaeological history. Today, we're going to dig into 5 discoveries, and I mean that almost literally, 5 things found beneath the Sahara that are completely rewriting what we thought we knew about this desert, about human history, and honestly, about how fast and how violently the world can change. Stay with me, because this story gets wild. Let's start with something that sounds like it belongs in a science fiction novel. In the latter part of the 20th century, researchers working with early satellite radar imaging technology pointed their instruments at the eastern Sahara, specifically at regions in modern-day Egypt, Sudan, and Chad. They weren't expecting to find much. Sand, more sand, maybe some interesting geological formations. What they found instead stopped them cold. Beneath the surface, hidden under meters of shifting sand, their radar picked up the unmistakable signatures of river channels. Not small streams, not seasonal trickles. We're talking about enormous, wide, ancient rivers. Broad main channels flanked by networks of branching tributaries, the kind of complex drainage system that typically develops over thousands and thousands of years in lush, water-rich environments. These channels, which scientists would eventually call paleochannels, paleo meaning ancient, stretched for hundreds of miles across the desert. Some of the main channels were comparable in width to major rivers we know today. The branching patterns were continuous and organized, meaning this wasn't just scattered water pooling randomly. This was a functioning long-term river system. Something that had carried enormous volumes of water across this region for potentially thousands of years. Now, radar doesn't pick up water. What it picked up were the physical shapes carved into the bedrock beneath the sand. The valleys, the banks, the beds of rivers that once flowed, and then, at some point, simply stopped. Think about what it takes to carve channels like that into solid rock. Think about the sustained flow of water, year after year, decade after decade, slowly grinding away at stone. These weren't flash flood channels from a single rainy season. These were the marks of a persistent, established river network that existed across a landscape that is today one of the driest places on Earth. Scientists began mapping these ghost rivers, and what emerged was staggering. There appear to have been multiple river systems operating across different parts of the Sahara, some of them potentially connecting to larger basins or even draining into bodies of water that no longer exist. The scale of the hydrological network, the entire water movement system, suggested a Sahara that was radically, almost incomprehensibly different from what we see today. Geologists and climate scientists have a name for the period when this was happening. They call it the African Humid Period, or sometimes the Green Sahara. It refers to a stretch of time, roughly between 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, when shifts in Earth's orbital patterns caused the West African monsoon to push much further north than it does today. Rain fell regularly across the Sahara, vegetation spread, lakes filled, and rivers ran. But here's the thing that really gets me. We're not talking about a minor variation in rainfall. We're talking about a fundamental transformation of an continent-sized region. The Sahara, which today covers roughly the same area as the continental United States, was for thousands of years green, wet, alive, and the rivers were the veins of that living world. When the radar data was cross-referenced with ground studies, researchers found that the ancient channels corresponded with areas where the soil composition, the sediment layering, and the mineral deposits all told the same story. Water had been there. Lots of it. For a long time. These aren't just interesting lines on a radar map. They're the skeleton of an entire lost ecosystem. And as we're about to see, what was living in and around that ecosystem is even more remarkable. Now, here's where things get genuinely fascinating, in a way that I don't think gets talked about enough. Back in the mid-20th century, during a period of significant geological and oil exploration across North Africa. Researchers drilled boreholes deep into the Saharan bedrock. These are basically long, narrow holes drilled straight down into the earth, and the material that comes up the sediment cores gets archived, stored away, sometimes for decades. And here's the thing about scientific archives. They're incredible time capsules. Samples collected in the 1950s and 1960s, back when the technology to analyze them properly didn't even exist, were sitting in storage, waiting. And when modern researchers went back to look at them with 21st century techniques, they found something nobody had anticipated. Inside the sediment layers, corresponding to those ancient river periods, there was biological material, preserved organic traces. Things that should not, by any reasonable expectation, have survived in a desert environment for thousands of years. Pollen grains. Tiny, extraordinarily resilient little structures that plants release to reproduce. Under a microscope, each species of plant produces pollen with a distinctive shape, a biological fingerprint. And when scientists identified the pollen in those cores, they found species that do not and cannot grow in today's Sahara. Grasses, aquatic plants, trees that require consistent rainfall, species that today you'd find in the savannas and woodlands of sub-Saharan Africa. The pollen was telling a story. It was saying, we were here. There was enough water for us to grow. The land was alive. But it didn't stop there. Alongside the pollen, researchers found plant fibers, microscopic filaments from vegetation that had once grown along the riverbanks and in the water. And perhaps most remarkably, they found fragments of freshwater microorganisms. Tiny biological structures from organisms that live only in freshwater environments, organisms that simply cannot exist in dry desert conditions. Finding them in the heart of the Sahara means only one thing. The water was there first. What makes this discovery so powerful is the precision it offers. It's one thing to say, based on radar imaging, that rivers probably once ran here. It's another thing entirely to hold up actual biological evidence from inside those sediment cores and say, look, here are the living organisms that inhabited those rivers. Here is the plant life that lined those banks. Here is proof, preserved for thousands of years in the earth itself, that this place was once teeming with life. The sediment cores also preserve something called a record of deposition. Basically, the layers tell you about time. Coarser sediments settle when water moves fast. Finer sediments settle when water is slow or still. Scientists can read these layers almost like pages in a book, building a timeline of how the river system changed, when it was at its fullest, when it began to slow, and when, eventually, it dried up entirely. That drying up is one of the most significant environmental transitions in human history. And understanding it matters enormously, because the people who lived along these rivers didn't just disappear when the water did. They moved, they adapted. And some researchers believe that the drying of the Sahara may have played a direct role in pushing early human populations toward the Nile Valley, potentially contributing to the conditions that led to the rise of ancient Egyptian civilization. That's a massive claim, and it's still debated. But the biological evidence in those old, dusty sediment cores is a critical piece of that puzzle. Okay, so we have rivers, we have biological life. Now, let's talk about the people. Because here is where the story stops being just about geology and climate science and becomes something deeply personally human. Embedded in the sediment of those ancient riverbeds, and along what would have been the banks of those long-vanished waterways, archaeologists have found stone tools, and not rough, accidental-looking rocks that might have been shaped by natural processes. These are deliberately crafted tools, worked by human hands with skill and intention. The tools show what archaeologists call deliberate flake scars, the specific marks left when a person strikes a stone with another stone or with a harder material to knock off precise flakes and create a sharp edge or a particular shape. This isn't something that happens by accident. It's a technique. It requires knowledge passed from person to person, generation to generation. It's craft. Now, finding old stone tools in the Sahara isn't entirely new. Archaeologists have known for some time that people once lived in the region during wetter periods. What makes these particular finds remarkable is the detail. First, the tools themselves are advanced. These aren't the earliest, most basic forms of stone working. Some of the tools found in these riverbank sediment layers show real sophistication, carefully shaped with multiple stages of refinement. They represent populations of people who had developed real expertise in tool making over a long period of time. But second, and this is the part that genuinely made me stop and think when I first read about it, The mineral composition of the tools doesn't match the local geology. Let that sink in for a moment. The stone used to make these tools came from somewhere else. When researchers analyzed the material, they found it originated from sources hundreds of kilometers away from where the tools were discovered, which means someone carried these stones, or the tools made from them, across enormous distances. Why does that matter? Because it tells us something profound about how these people were living and moving. Carrying raw materials or finished tools across hundreds of kilometers suggests trade networks or long-distance travel routes, or both. It suggests that the people living along these ancient rivers weren't isolated little groups, scratching out a subsistence existence. They were connected. They were moving. They knew the landscape far beyond their immediate surroundings. The river corridors would have been the natural highways through this otherwise difficult terrain. If you imagine the ancient Sahara, wetter than today but still challenging in many areas, those river valleys with their water, their vegetation, their animal life, would have been the obvious routes to travel, and people did travel them. For generations, long enough to move stone from one end of the region to the other. This is the picture that's emerging from the archaeological record. Not wandering, isolated bands of early humans stumbling around a landscape they barely understood, but mobile, knowledgeable, connected people who understood their environment deeply and used it skillfully. And if you're still not convinced, the next discovery is going to seal it. Scattered along those ancient river corridors, researchers have found something that is honestly beautiful in its simplicity. Campsites, not the ruins of cities, not monuments or burial sites or anything dramatic, just small patches of ancient ground that tell a quiet, intimate story about people stopping at the end of a long day and making a fire. Here's how archaeologists identify these spots. They look for clusters of specific materials appearing together in the same location. Ash-rich sediment, indicating the remnants of fire. Fractured stone, showing where tools were made or used nearby. And elevated carbon levels in the soil, which is essentially what remains when organic material, wood, plant matter, food, is burned repeatedly over time. These clusters appear at regular intervals along the river corridors, evenly spaced, positioned, when you look at them on a map, in the kinds of locations where a traveler moving along a river route would naturally stop. Elevated ground near the water. Places with visibility in multiple directions, sheltered from wind. Somebody chose these spots deliberately. The spacing matters enormously. When you find a single campsite, you have one data point. When you find many of them, distributed at regular intervals across a landscape, you're looking at a pattern. And patterns indicate something organized. Something intentional. Not just a place where someone happened to spend a night once, but a route. A path that people used again and again over a long period of time. Think about the long-distance routes that humans have used throughout history. The Silk Road, the trade routes of medieval Africa, the pilgrimage paths of religious traditions. These routes developed because they were practical, because they connected resources and people, and because once established, they got used. They became known. They became part of how a culture moved through the world. The ancient Saharan river corridors appear to have been something like that. These weren't random camps. This was a network of established stopping points along a known route. The elevated carbon levels are particularly telling because they suggest repeated use over time rather than a single event. You don't get significantly elevated carbon in a patch of ground from one campfire. You get it from fires being made in the same place over and over, across many years or even many generations. These were not random travelers passing through once. These were people who knew this place, who came back, who recognized this particular bend in the river or this particular elevated bank as a good place to stop. Maybe they'd been there before. Maybe their parents had told them about it. And sitting around those fires, making tools from stones they'd carried for hundreds of kilometers, surrounded by a landscape that was green and alive and cut through with the sound of moving water, they couldn't have imagined that one day all of it would be gone. They couldn't have known what was coming. This is where the story takes a turn. A dark, dramatic, almost cinematic turn. Because buried beneath the sand of the Sahara, there is something else. Something that dwarfs the rivers, the campsites, the tools, all of it in terms of sheer physical scale. There is a crater. Not a small one. Not a geological quirk or a modest depression that could have formed through gradual erosion. We're talking about an enormous circular basin. Symmetrical in a way that nature doesn't usually produce. Spanning dozens of kilometers across, hidden deep beneath the desert sand. It wasn't visible from the surface for the simple reason that the sand covers it. But radar imaging and deep geological surveys revealed its shape, a vast, bowl-like depression with the distinct circular geometry that scientists associate with one specific kind of event, a meteorite impact. And the physical evidence backs this up in multiple ways. First, there are what geologists call shatter cones, rocks that have been crushed in a very particular, very distinctive way that only happens under the extreme pressures generated by a high-velocity impact. You cannot produce this kind of deformation through normal geological processes. It requires a sudden, enormous force. Second, the layering of the rock around and beneath the depression is disrupted. The normal, organized horizontal layering of sedimentary rock, which builds up steadily over millions of years, is violently disordered. Something hit this region with enough force to literally scramble the Earth's layers. And third, this detail is incredible. Researchers found heat-formed glass particles in the material. When a meteorite strikes the Earth, the energy released is so extreme that it can instantaneously melt rock and fuse it into glass. Finding these particles is essentially finding the fingerprint of an ancient explosion. Now, the timing of this impact is still a matter of ongoing research, and pinning down exactly when it occurred is genuinely difficult. But the geological evidence places it within a range that overlaps, at least potentially, with the period when the Green Sahara was transitioning into the barren desert we know today, which raises a question that researchers have been cautiously exploring. Could an impact of this scale have contributed to the climate change that ended the Green Sahara? This is not a simple question, and there's no simple answer. The end of the African humid period is primarily understood as the result of gradual changes in Earth's orbital cycles. The same forces that had brought the monsoon north eventually shifted, and the rain retreated south again. That's the dominant scientific consensus. The drying of the Sahara was largely already in motion due to these orbital factors. But a catastrophic impact event, one large enough to leave a crater spanning dozens of kilometers, would have had effects. Debris thrown into the atmosphere, fires across a wide area, local climate disruption on a significant scale. Whether it accelerated a decline that was already beginning, or whether it struck at a moment that coincided with the transition, is something scientists are still working to understand. What we can say with confidence is this: the crater is real. The impact happened, and it happened in the same general region and era that we're talking about, the once living Sahara, with its rivers and its people and its fires burning in the night. Imagine being there when it hit. The light in the sky, the sound, the shockwave rolling across the landscape. Whatever communities had built their lives along those rivers would have experienced something terrifying and incomprehensible. And then the slow realization, over years and decades and generations, that the rains were not coming back, that the rivers were shrinking, that the green world was becoming sand. So let's pull back and look at the full picture, because I think it's genuinely extraordinary. Beneath the sand of the Sahara lies the ghost of an entire world. Ancient rivers that once carried water across hundreds of miles of what is now barren desert. Sediment cores holding the biological fingerprints of plants and organisms that lived in and around that water thousands of years ago. Stone tools crafted with skill and carried across vast distances by people who knew this landscape as a living, productive place. Campsites spaced along river corridors where those people stopped, again and again, to rest and build fires and continue their journeys. And buried beneath it all, the scar of a violent cosmic event, a crater kilometers wide, a reminder that catastrophe can come from the sky without warning and reshape an entire region in a moment. Each one of these discoveries on its own would be remarkable. Together, they're telling us a story that we're only beginning to fully understand. The Sahara was not always a desert. That's not new information. Scientists have known this in general terms for decades. But what's becoming clearer, piece by piece, discovery by discovery, is just how alive it was. How connected, how inhabited, and how quickly. In geological terms, but also in terms of human experience across generations. It all changed. There's something in this story that feels relevant to us right now. We live in a world where climate change is no longer a distant theoretical concern, but an observable, measurable reality. The idea that a vast habitable region of the Earth could transform into a desert, that rivers could vanish, that ecosystems could collapse, that people could be displaced from landscapes their ancestors had lived in for thousands of years. That's not science fiction. That's what happened in the Sahara. The people who built fires on those riverbanks didn't know their world was ending. They adapted as best they could. They moved. Some of them may have made their way to the Nile, where the water still ran, and contributed in some way to what would eventually become one of the greatest civilizations in human history. We have something they didn't have. We have the ability to look at the geological record, to read what's written in sediment cores and radar scans and ancient stone tools and say, here is what happened. Here is what the Earth looked like before. Here is what changed and why. The question is whether we're listening. The Sahara is still keeping its secrets, slowly. And every new scan, every new borehole, every new analysis of material that's been sitting in a storage room for 60 years is adding another line to a story that's been waiting, buried under the sand, for us to find it. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely, this is one of those topics that I find endlessly fascinating, and I hope it sparked the same feeling in you. That sense that the world is so much older and stranger and richer than our everyday lives let us see. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment telling me which discovery blew your mind the most. Was it the ghost rivers? The ancient campsites? The crater? I'm genuinely curious. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden history of our planet, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. See you in the next one.